We are live. Hello, Andrew. Welcome back.
Thank you, Laura. It's good to be back with you.
How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Fall, I can feel fall in the air. I love fall.
Yeah.
So I
Oh,
feel
yeah. I know it's coming all of a sudden. So let's see. We're back to do part 2 of our show that we did last week. We just kind of ran out of time for all our questions. So I'm back with more questions. So if you're ready, let's jump in. Okay.
yes,
So
let's do it.
I was having this very interesting conversation with someone the other day who was raised around, like they can remember being a kid and a young teen when the Latin Mass was still the norm and before the Reform took place. And they were commenting on like, well, traditionalists of today are just doing the same thing that good old Catholicism was doing back then, right? Like there's no difference. That's all. They just are perpetuating and, keeping up these same values and things. And like to him, there was absolutely no difference. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I was going to ask you about that. Like, could you expound maybe on that the traditional Catholic movement of today is not the same movement as the good old Catholicism of yesterday? What would you say about that?
Sure. So the number one difference, of course, is that now they have a static liturgical form or liturgical expression that is not overseen by the Pope and the rest of the Church as far as continuing like its development, as far as being like a living liturgy of the Church. So in the past, the Church, of course, in its liturgical calendar and rites, has made changes based off of the needs of the faithful and as well as the culture of the time. And one of the main things that are often added, of course, are saints. But if you have a static expression, if you're not part of the church, and I'm not exactly sure how the Fraternity of St. Peter and Institute of the Christ the King handle new saints. I'm sure they probably have a system, but at least their participation in the 1962 Missal would probably be a little bit more living in that they probably have commemorations of new saints. But of course, in the SSPX and the State of a Contest and the more extreme elements of the movement, you don't have that. It just saints, the canonization of saints and their addition to the calendar, as well as other changes to the Missal, just stopped. It just died, 1958. Whereas before, there were always changes that were being made by the popes, whether it was things like Pope St. Pius X lowering the age of communion and encouraging younger and younger to receive, or whether it was his changes to the breviary or the changes of Pius XII to the Easter liturgy. Those were just, of course, the more modern examples. But I mean, you can go back. I mean, Benedict XV, the popes are constantly kind of changing, and so there's this feeling of movement. It's kind of a paradox because you have these elements that don't necessarily change, so you have timelessness, but yet at the same time it's living, so there is still a change. And several years back, I attended a conference, a sacred liturgy conference over in Spokane, Washington. And the title of that conference was The Living Waters of the Eucharist. And I thought that was just such a beautiful theme for that conference, because the expression that Jesus uses, living waters, and he's actually uses it in specific reference to worship, is, I would say, the most accurate description of what a true liturgy or true worship should look like. You have these unchanging elements, such as the source of the stream, the dynamics or nature of water, the banks, although those even change, albeit slowly, those even change over time. But as far as the route of the river, you have these certain elements that are unchanging, but then you have the movement of the water. You have this constant renewal that moves through, and that's what a liturgy should look like. It should not be stagnant. If you have something that's stagnant, then that's never been the case for the traditional Christian and historical Christian way of worship. there's always been these dynamic changes that have been done by, at least within the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition, by the legitimate authorities. So just on a liturgical level, that's already an example of one way that traditionalist Catholicism is not the same, or not the same as the Catholicism that went before, because before it had the guidance of the magisterium and the popes and the bishops, whereas now it's merely preserved by whoever the leadership of whatever traditionalist group it happens to be. So that's already a big difference right there. And that's not even getting into any of the doctrinal differences, because besides liturgical, I mean, of course, you have the fact that these traditionalist groups are not receiving updated and new, what would you call it, applications of Christian doctrine to the contemporary situation. The leadership that is usually being provided by the leadership of whatever group that happens to be, rather than by the divinely appointed pope and bishops in union with them. So those are already two really major ways that the traditionalist movement is not the same as the Catholicism that went before.
Yeah, right. Even though, I mean, there's traditionalists, not necessarily Catholic, because they've taken themselves so far out with their ideologies, but then even traditionalists within the church that attend, diocesan parishes where they offer the old rite mass or things like that. I mean, even that, I feel like it has a distinct character and attitude, the people that adhere to that, and like why they adhere to it. It's not usually just because, oh, I just found this, I thought it was so cool and I just want it all, like, so here I am. I've almost never encountered that kind of an attitude. It seems really like another kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say that attitude would probably be common among the newbies, the people who are just discovering it. It'd be like, oh, wow, look at this. This is so beautiful. And they're drawn into that. Yeah. And maybe some people stay on more that superficial level, but I feel like most of us are passionate to learn. And one of the first things people want to know is, okay, well, why was my experience different from the experience I'm having now in this traditional community? And so then they start coming up with reasons. Because, of course, we also want to give reasons for why we'd make a switch. And why we would maybe take stands like, I don't attend Novus Ordo Parish, I only attend TLM. So almost everybody makes that transition. Almost nobody, except maybe more superficial characters, stay on that, oh, I just like it. And so, this is what I'm doing just because I like. I mean, you might have some more sanguine temperaments like that, but most people are eventually start reading the blogs, reading, the influencers, Taylor Marshall, et cetera, and they start coming up with reasons like, I don't attend the Novus Ordo Missae because it was come up with by Freemasons and Protestants, and that's why I go to the Mass of the Ages, as it was said by Christ himself. Oh no, actually not even just by Christ himself, it's the same sacrifice of Abel. Doggone it, Adam probably was expelled from the garden for saying the Novus Ordo Missae, right? That was the beginning, right? I mean, this is kind of some of the, I obviously I'm using hyperbole, but
right. No, I've heard stuff like that.
Attitude is we were doing what has always been done from the very, very beginning. Like, there's never been change. And, that of course is not consistent with, the actual facts of history.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's a good reflection on that. Okay, help me flesh it out. So, the next question I have is, do you think traditionalism is a more insidious and dangerous problem than liberalism is for the church?
I don't know if I'd necessarily say it's a problem, or more dangerous problem to the church specifically, because, of course, both are dangerous. But I would say that traditionalism is more dangerous to faithful Catholics. So, people want, are constantly railing about the Father James Martins or this or that heterodox bishop or this or that abuse or this or that, liberal movement or liberal theologian in the church. But your typical faithful Catholic who wants to be faithful to the church and live according to the teachings of Christ are not going to be drawn in by those people. Usually it's the more lax people who want a justification for maybe a certain lifestyle, or they want more of a loose or liberal way of living out their faith. They might be drawn to that. But the danger of traditionalist Catholicism is to faithful Catholics, because to all appearances, everything seems to be in order. Everybody seems to be reverent. They seem to be teaching traditional doctrine. And so it looks like a more authentic living of Catholicism. But deep down, it's just as rotten as progressivist or liberal Catholicism, because at its root is a spirit of rebellion, a spirit of disobedience, a refusal to be led by those who have been appointed by Christ for our day and age, and who have the authentic mission passed down to them of guiding the church through whatever time period you might happen to find yourself in. That is an essential aspect of being Catholic. We are not self-directed. We are directed by the church. And an example of this, of course, can be found even in the act of faith itself. We do not say, I believe all the truths which the Holy Catholic Church teaches because they're traditional. Right? That's not in the act of faith. We believe all the truths which the Holy Catholic Church teaches because God has revealed them, because God's authority has been invested into his church, whether we understand them or not. That we believe that. And you can find that in the tradition all throughout this attitude of Catholic submission to the authority of the church. St. Augustine himself said that I would not believe even the Gospels if the authority of the church did not move me to do so. That is the Catholic perspective when it comes to authority. So again, you have this idea. The other thing is that the traditional Catholic movement has different idols, and of course, I don't want to paint with a broad brush. I wouldn't necessarily even want to paint with a broad brush for liberal or even those who consider themselves liberal or progressivist Catholics, because many of them are actually very authentic Christians who may be confused, but many of them have the spirit of really trying to live Catholicism, and you can see that in their acts of mercy, helping the poor, and social justice. And it's funny, so many people will be like, oh, social justice, bad taste. But we as Catholics are actually supposed to be living authentic social justice. And that's something that is definitely an emphasis in, among liberal and progressive types. And so just as you can acknowledge those types, also within traditional Catholicism, of course, you have people who they want to worship reverently. They want to hang on to some of these very beneficial and good cultural practices that are traditional. And these things are good. But at the same time, in general, you can still speak in generalities as far as, even though you might have some of these exceptions, the typical, just as in the liberal and progressivist wing, you have heterodoxy, and you have people who are resisting the authority of the church and the authority of the Pope, especially in areas such as contraception, women's ordination, the LGBTQ agenda, things like that. So also on the traditionalist side, you have them resisting the authority of the church as far as liturgical reform is concerned, as well as the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, or these various teachings or directions that the church has chosen to take for our time. So both are acting in a spirit of rebellion. So even though they happen to be about different things, and one may look cleaner and more faithful than the other, both of them are resisting. And you can see this in their common animosity that they have toward the Pope or toward the authorities of Rome, right? So you'd have the progressivist who is upset at the Pope because of his stance on abortion, his condemnation of abortion, of his hard stance toward the German bishops and the blessing of homosexual unions, all those things. And so also you have the animosity of the traditionalist, the radical traditionalist toward the Pope with regards to the restrictions on the 1962 rite of Mass at the diocesan level, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the dangerous spirit. And the reason it's more dangerous to the faithful Catholic is because it looks more faithful. Just like the Pharisees would have been more of a danger to somebody who was trying to be a faithful Jew, they would then be exposed to the rot, excuse me, that was within the Pharisees. And one common, actually, it's very interesting because one common critique that is made by traditionalists is, oh, we're picked on. There's often this victim mentality. We're more abused by the hierarchy. We're the ones who are condemned, and they allow those who are more lax and liberal to go, to go free.
Right.
That same critique could have been said about Christ. Isn't it very interesting? He was the most hard on those Jews who were actually the most faithful, who would have been closer to him in their beliefs than even, say, the liberal Sadducees. And he was, of course, he was hard on the Sadducees too, and he also called the lax to conversion. But he was more easy on those who were sinners, right? And more hard on those who gave this exterior of being faithful, but who had lost the true spirit that is supposed to go into worship, right? They also had a kind of idolatry. They had made an idol of their way of life, of the law. And a great scene from the Chosen series, which I have enjoyed very, very much, is there's this interaction between one of the chief rabbis, Nicodemus, and another rabbi. And Nicodemus is starting to question because he's starting to have these encounters with Christ, and he's wondering, he's had his meeting, and he's wondering if it's bigger than the perspective that the Pharisees have about the law. And he's offering, excuse me, a little something in my throat. He's offering these questions to this other rabbi, Shmuel, I believe. And he says, what if we're wrong about the law? And Shmuel says, the law is God. He makes this statement that the law, like he has actually equated the law with being God. They've actually made an idol out of the law itself. Something that is good, they have, instead of taking and having it be a means, they've actually made it an end. And that is the temptation and the downfall, the pitfall that so many traditionalist Catholics are prone to, is making an idol of the means to worship, making an idol of the traditional Latin Mass, and putting it in a place in the hierarchy of truths where it does not belong. As Catholics, we know that a requirement for our salvation is to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. That is a requirement for our salvation. What kind of rite of Mass that we have is not a requirement for our salvation. And a good historical example of this would be when the Pope Saint Pius V suppressed the other liturgical rites that were less than 200 years old around the time of the Council of Trent. Would you have resisted his authority and saying, no, this rite is good. It has been in my family for generations, and the Pope is abusing his authority and he cannot take this away from his. Would that have been a proper Catholic attitude? And if you don't think so, and if you think that the Catholics should have in fact submitted to the authority of the Pope, of Pope St. Pius V in this area, and you would be right to do so, then by that same logic, you cannot say that the authority does not have, the Pope does not have the authority to abrogate the 1962 rite or that practice and put in its place the Reformed rite of 1969. That is completely within the prerogatives of the Pope's authority. And even traditionalist apologists such as Michael Davies have acknowledged this.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, if we stop trusting that the church knows what's best for us, even if we can't understand, you have to acknowledge that there's a lot of things that we don't see and aren't privy to, and the church is there to guide us. It would be like children telling their parents, no, you don't know what's good for me. Like, I shouldn't listen to what you say. Yes. I'm making the decisions around here because you're nuts. And it's like, oh man, like if your kids did that to you, you'd just be like, well, honey, you just go ahead and see how that works out for you, because unfortunately, I do know more than you do about this, and you're going to find out, but it's going to hurt. Like, you don't want them to have
Yes.
to go through that. Why are we Catholic
Yes.
if we can't trust the church? I mean, really, you might as well be
Yes.
Protestant. You might as well be whatever you want.
That's exactly right. And for those who object when it comes to like the liturgical, because that's one of the chief issues that are taken by traditionalists. When it comes to that, some of them will say, well, Pope Paul VI and the Concilium were not faithful to the principles laid out, and they went further than the reforms laid out by the fathers at the Second Vatican Council. And that's utter nonsense to pit the count. And as a matter of fact, it's the error of conciliarism, which has been condemned by the church, which is this idea that a council can be above the Pope's authority. The reason why the document Sacrosanctum Concilium has its authority as a ecumenical document from a council is because it was given that authority by Pope Paul VI. And Pope Paul VI used that same authority to go further and to do things that he believed were necessary for the reform of the rite, or that he believed were actually faithful to what the council was calling for. He was completely within his exercise to even go beyond the parameters that were set for the council, because the Pope is above the council. So you cannot pit the ecumenical council against the Pope. I mean, it's just utter nonsense.
Right. That's a really good point. It's so interesting that you talk about idols, because I've definitely run into that attitude a lot, especially with the emotional reaction I often encounter when I'm talking to traditional Catholics about, what they care about, which, you feel very strongly about. And that's totally understandable. These are the most important things. But it does seem a little bit like, wow, like I really care about what I believe in too. And, but I can still keep calm and like be open to other things. Like, I want to know that I'm in line with the church. And if I find that I'm not, it's like, whoa, like maybe it doesn't feel good at first, but I definitely want to know so that I can realign myself. But what is that? What we're running into, you keep saying idols, and I'm wondering, are there any scriptural parallels that would help us to understand kind of what's going on here? Or even, this principle of like making an idol out of the worship itself instead of the God who's being worshiped.
That's right. Yeah, there definitely are. And some of the ones that I can think of are you can find this theme all throughout Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, which was that what was more important than even the sacrifices that were commanded by God were the spirit of obedience in which they were offered. The point of the slaughtering of animals and all of the rituals and commands were not just to do them for their own sake. There was that element of offering, of the necessity for what would you call it, propitiation or reparation for sin, and that death was required, and that all of these things were leading up to and were a prefiguration of the ultimate sacrifice of Christ that was required in order to restore us to the kingdom of heaven. But as you can see, that what was more important to God than even the concrete observance or even the faithful observance of these precepts was the spirit of obedience in which they were offered in. And you can see that in if you go and read, for example, Isaiah chapter 1, where God says that your sacrifices. As a matter of fact, why don't I go ahead and pull it up here, because it'll be good for people to hear. Let's see, we'll pull up Isaiah 1. Okay. All right. Here it is. So if we go down, so the prophet Isaiah is admonishing the people because they're being unfaithful. We go down to verse 11. It says, "To what purpose do you offer me the multitude of your victims, saith the Lord? I am full. I desire not holocaust of rams and fat of fatlings and blood of calves and lambs and buck goats. When you came to appear before me, you required these things at your hands, that you should walk in my courts. Offer sacrifice no more in vain. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons, the Sabbaths, and other festivals I will not abide. your assemblies are wicked. My soul hateth your new moons and your solemnities. They are become troublesome to me, and I am weary of bearing them. And when you stretch forth your hands, I will turn away my eyes from you. And when you multiply prayer, I will not hear, for your hands are full of blood. And he goes on to tell themselves to wash themselves, to make themselves clean, because, I mean, it seems odd because he commanded that they do all of these things.
Yeah.
But the
Right.
problem is that they are being unfaithful to him. They're being unfaithful in their hearts. And so what they are doing in their worship is a lie, because the reason for those things is he wants the sacrifice of our hearts. He wants the oblation of our souls. He wants us on that altar,
Mhm.
not just the going through the motions and the rituals and all those things. He wants
Yeah.
our heart, because all of this comes down to God seeking us, to wanting to bring us into fullness of union with him. And you can see
Mhm.
this again in like Psalm 50, for example, uh, where David says in verse 18, for if thou, quote, for if thou hadst desired sacrifice, and for other Bibles, it's Psalm 51. I'm reading from the Douay Rheims, since that's one that's known or most common in traditionalist circles. So
Mhm.
in Psalm 50 or 51, for those who have a different version, verse 18, he says, for if thou hadst desired sacrifice, I would indeed have given it. With burnt offerings thou wilt not be delighted. A sacrifice to God is an afflicted spirit. A contrite and humbled heart, O God, thou wilt not despise.
Wow.
And then finally, there's this other very interesting situation that happens in the first book of Samuel, where um, the prophet Samuel tells there's going to be a battle, and before the battle, there's going to be offering of sacrifice, and the prophet Samuel has to go away for a bit, and he tells Saul, wait for me, and uh, and Saul decides not to wait, and he offers the sacrifice, um, and then Samuel comes back and finds that he has offered the sacrifice, and he says, "Why have you done this? You were told not to do this, and because you have done this thing, you will have the kingship taken from your line." And then he goes on to say, "Because obedience is better than sacrifice." So it wasn't what Samuel or what King Saul had done was wrong, because King David himself would go on to do the same thing with no repercussions, and it was
Yeah.
right for King David to do that. But Saul did this in a spirit of rebellion, of resistance, because he did not trust that that Samuel had a plan, or what God's plan was. He felt he needed to, he could see the enemy forces coming, and he had to make this decision. He had to save the people. He took it upon himself instead of trusting God, and said, I've got
Mm.
to take this into my own hands. And because of that, he was punished with one of the most severe things that could, he
Right.
had the kingship taken away from his line. And so
Right.
when you go and you go, it's let's see, it's First Samuel chapter 15, and if you go to verse 22, it says, "And Samuel said, Doth the Lord desire holocausts and victims, and not rather the voice of the Lord should be obeyed? For obedience is better than sacrifices, and to hearken rather than to offer the fat of rams. Because it is like the sin of witchcraft to rebel, and like the crime of idolatry to refuse to obey. For as much, therefore, as thou hast rejected the word of the Lord has also rejected thee from being king." Close quote. Isn't that
Wow.
interesting? Isn't that interesting that he says,
Amazing.
because it is like the sin of witchcraft to rebel, like the crime of idolatry to refuse to obey.
Wow.
And that's why I try to show that what's happening here is a form of idolatry, even though there isn't a kind of explicit, they're not like bowing down and worshiping a 1962 missile, right?
Yeah. Right.
But they have placed this rite of mass um, above even the commands of God,
Yeah.
because Christ commanded that we be submissive to our pastors, that we follow their direction, And one of the things that is under their authority is the guiding and changing and preservation of the worship of God. And you can imagine for Catholics who have been attached to certain forms in time period, again, that the one I've brought it before, the time of the Council of Trent, there were probably Catholics who were deeply, deeply attached to those liturgical expressions. And they had a choice to make. They said, am I going to obey God? Am I going to submit myself to the will of those he has placed in authority? Or am I going to rebel? Am I going to disobey? That was a choice that they had to make. And that's a choice that we also in our time have to make. And so people have to realize the gravity. So often, disobedience is put down as some kind of, it's just disobedience. It's just disobedience.
Right.
We have to disobedience because when the law of man is going against the law of God, you have to disobey that for the sake of the higher law. According to who? According to your interpretation, because you don't trust the church anymore. That's taking things and putting it into your own hands now. That's exactly what Saul did with Samuel. And that's one of the reasons why I've been talking about this, is because I'm appealing to people to wake up and realize the gravity of the situation. It's not there's something very insidious going on in the traditional Catholic movement that is ultimately going to destroy it and take it out of the church. And in many ways, such as the Society of St. Pius X and Sedevacantists groups, it has already done so. And you can already see with a lot of these figures who have placed their loyalty to this particular rite of Mass over and above their loyalty to the church and to the Pope. They are already on a trajectory outside of the church. It's a very grave situation.
Right. Wow. That comparison to witchcraft is really creepy. Right. It's not like, smiling at the contrariness of a willful child. Like, even then, I mean, that grows into a bigger and bigger problem the longer you let it develop. But it's like, it's not such a little thing. You're setting yourself up and your own ideas, your own preferences, and your judgment over everything God has given you to guide you. It's very presumptuous. Yeah. And it's also your distinction that it's not the form of what Saul did that was condemned. The sacrifice itself is like, that is something that otherwise God would require at times. So the form of the 1962 missal, it's not like it's harmful to your faith or deficient in any way, but it's like, why are you doing what you're doing? And that's what the difference is. What attitude are you bringing to it? Wow.
That's exactly right. And as I've pointed out elsewhere as well, it's saying doing these things, some of these actions, like getting some priests getting themselves ordained, or some of them have left their orders, like FSSP priests have left their orders in order to speak out against Traditionis Custodes, or saying, or in the case of the Society of St. Pius X, saying the Mass illicitly in a state of suspension, the priest saying the Mass illicitly. That is a sacrilege. That is an abuse, just as much an abuse as those who are abusing the new rite of Mass, the 1969 rite of Mass, and saying it on a floaty in the ocean, or saying a clown Mass. Both of those things are a rebellion against God, and therefore not pleasing to God. So we have to step back and say, why are we doing what we're doing? And are our actions consistent with the faithful actions of a Catholic?
Yeah, right. Oh, wow, that's awesome. Also, I have in my hands, I've got this book that you and Dom from the Logos Project, you were talking about the other day, The Pope, the Council, and the Mass. And boy, is that thing loaded. But I read this little letter excerpt from Charles Journet. Was he a cardinal? Yes, Cardinal Charles Journet in 1969, right before he started celebrating the Novus Ordo. Do you think it's okay if I read that real quick?
Yeah. Go right
ahead. I was just like, wow, is this a Catholic attitude or what? Like, it was so inspiring. And you can tell he's suffering, but it's like his attitude of obedience is so profound. So he writes, the Holy Father has very pointedly asked for obedience when the new Ordo Missae begins to be celebrated in the different dioceses of Switzerland. Tomorrow morning, for the first time, I will say the new Ordo Missae with profound obedience, pleased to have something to give to God. It will not be a little thing. For many years, I have celebrated the old Ordo, which I know almost by heart. Each time that I celebrate it, I discover new things. It is as dear to me as my own flesh and blood. I must now leave it. I am pleased to give something to God. Let me take care to say there is no renouncing of anything essential. I will return to this point in a moment. One renounces nothing essential pertaining to what is of divine law. The substance of the Mass remains absolutely the same. There is the offertory, the consecration, and the sovereign pontiff has recalled expressly what was not expressed sufficiently in the rubrics of the new Ordo, that the Mass is a sacrifice. He has recalled that there is a change of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. All these things, which are not Protestant, are truly Catholic and also Orthodox. Thus, there is the reaffirmation of the classic Catholic doctrine on the Eucharistic sacrifice. Certainly in all this, there is our acute sense of uprootedness. Must one accept it or not? Ah, yes, when one tears something dear away from us, and when this is demanded of us in the name of obedience for a future which is hidden from us, one must say yes. One must be content in saying yes. One must be content even to feel suffering. But it is with happiness that one suffers, for he has something to give to God. Thus, let us not get into a frenzy. There is no necessity for any uproar concerning the Mass. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't help. I mean, I've read Archbishop Lefebvre's different writings, and then I read this, and I'm just like, if Archbishop Lefebvre had said this, what a different path could have been made in the church for people.
Yeah. Isn't that an inspiring example of just a fidelity? Absolute fidelity to the church. In those words that he wrote, I could hear the echo of Mary's fiat. Let it be done unto me according to your word. I don't understand anything, everything about how this is going to be accomplished, but I trust God. I trust he is going to guide his people and that he'll never let us down. And that ultimately down the road, I will understand his way of salvation. That truly is the attitude of a Catholic. Yeah.
Right. Oh, swoon. Anyway, recommended. Charles René, he's awesome.
Yes.
Also, my next question is, I remember you once telling me about an experience you had in relation to the Novus Ordo while you were on a retreat. And if you wouldn't mind sharing that, I feel like it would help the viewers to connect with your discovery of what the church gave us by the Reform and what it what it meant to you to finally embrace that.
Yes, certainly. So after I came back into full communion, of course, I was still very much attached to the 1962 rites of Mass, as well as the Divine Office, and so I continued to say those and to gravitate toward those. And whenever there was an opportunity in our diocese to go and attend one, and it was even a Latin Mass Society that I helped to start, and to encourage that and support priests to be able to say that in our diocese. That was my initial foray as I was coming into the church. I still was holding on to this because even though I accepted the validity of the Reformed sacraments and I didn't believe they were evil anymore, that they would harm my faith, I still was holding them at arm's length. I still believed that they were lesser forms and that they would not nurture or nourish me in the way that I needed to be nourished, that they were somehow deficient, that the church had made a mistake. And it was probably several years later, I was attending a retreat, and it was also around the time I actually timed this retreat around the Feast of Saint Dominic, and I was reading. One of the themes for this retreat was the dialogues of Saint Catherine of Siena, and one of the major themes in that book is obedience and the power of obedience and what that looks like for us in the Christian life. And its centrality. It was through an act of obedience that we were saved. It was through an act of disobedience that we were lost, and it was through Christ's perfect act of disobedience that we were again regained. So this virtue of obedience actually gets to the very crux of what it means to be in union with God or apart from God. And there's more than just the observing of the letter of the law and obedience, because you can just observe the letter of the law, but then there's also a spirit. It's like the mom says, clean your room, and you go and you shove all of your toys under the bed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you're observing the letter of the law, right? And you're cleaning your
Right.
room and getting it all, under the bed. But it's not an observance of the spirit of the law, which is to put things in the place they're supposed to
Yeah.
go in.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes for the spiritual life, our life as Catholics, and especially our life in relationship to the church and the guidance of the church. And so I was praying. It was around the time of one of the midday hours, and I went to the chapel to pray my office. And there was another priest who was there at the same time, and he was on the other side praying his office, or his liturgy of the hours. And I knew that we were saying the same hour, but our breviaries were not necessarily compatible, right? He was saying the Reformed, the ordinary expression, and I had a separate expression. I had the old expression. But I had this surging in my heart that I really wanted to pray with him. And so I had this sadness that kind of came over me because of the incompatibility of our prayer books. And then that made me realize, and I had this grasping that what is even more important than what particular ritual expression you happen to be using, what's even more important than that is that you be praying together. Because the liturgy of the hours, or the divine office, is the prayer of the church. It's the prayer of all of us, sons and daughters of the church, who are one body in Christ, saying the same prayers, the same inspired prayers together. Right. And the closer you can do that, like Christ said, where one or two are gathered in my name, there I am also with you. So even, let's just say, for the sake of argument, and I certainly don't accept this anymore, but let's say for the sake of argument that the older divine office was more perfect, and the liturgy of the hours, the Reformed rite of the divine office, is deficient. It is actually more pleasing to God to be praying together according to the lesser form than it would to just be praying by yourself with your own breviary in your own corner. Because we have these different gradations, right? I mean, yes, when you are praying and you unite your heart with the church, even when you're saying your breviary alone, yes, your voice is uniting with all the other Catholics. But a more perfect expression of that is when you're in physical proximity, like in a religious order or with another group of lay Catholics or with your fellow priests or your bishop, to be saying this together in proximity. That is a higher way of praying. And I grasped this. And I said, I'm actually, because of my own personal preference, I'm letting go of an even greater opportunity. So I was convicted by that. And then also, this priest had been trained by Benedictines in and how he said the Reformed rite of Mass. And he chanted almost the entire Mass, because one of the things in the Reformed rite of Mass that you can do that is not possible, and this is actually a restoration to the earlier rites, is you can actually sing the entire canon of the Mass, including the prayer of consecration over the bread and blood, over the bread and wine, and which is then transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And hearing those words, hearing the canon of the Mass, the words of institution sung, was one of the most powerful experiences I have ever had in my life. And that showed me that the potential of the Reformed rite of sacrament is so great if we would only faithfully apply it, if we would only truly try to implement this reform according to a traditional and faithful Catholic, and according to the rubrics and opportunities that have been offered according to the rite. We could actually have something that is more powerful and speaks more to our day and age, and is even harkens back to the way Christians used to worship, even more so than the 1962 Missal. And what was especially powerful about this experience was that in the Saint Dominic always sang the Mass. So he would even when he was even when he was saying it in private, he would always sing it. So there was this emphasis on the singing of it. As St. said, when you sing, you pray twice. And that is something that is so much more restricted in the 1962 rite of Mass. So
always
again,
the silent canon, certain things that are just,
right. I began to see, no, there is so much potential. There is so much beauty. There is so much goodness in these Reformed sacraments if we would only embrace it in gratitude as a gift from our mother's hands, from our Holy Mother, the Church. The heaven's the limit. I mean, it's just, yeah.
No, it's awesome. I mean, in the Church's writings on the divine office and the singing of the Psalms, she'll always say how, the Psalms are, wonderful and efficacious no matter what, but there's something that the character changes when it's sung. It becomes more itself than at any other time. And our Lord sang the Psalms with the apostles, and the Psalms are a part, that's the divine office, and they're a part of Mass. And it's like when things are to be the most solemn, they're sung. And it doesn't, you don't have to have instruments accompanying or, anything. The Church says it doesn't matter as long as the human voice is carrying it. It somehow ennobles what you're doing and raises it to another level that takes you closer to God. And it's like, wow, sign me up. Like, yes.
Yeah.
So cool. No, it's really what you said too. Your story about the Liturgy of the Hours reminded me of, so our family growing up prayed that every day together, multiple times a day. And one time we were praying with some friends and a traditionalist priest who we were getting to know, and he prayed evening prayer with us from our books. And it's the first time he'd ever prayed from the new office, because he was an FSSP priest. He always prayed out of the older breviary. And so he prayed with us, which was awesome of him. But afterward, I overheard that he said to a friend of his, I can't believe that this counts for my obligation of, saying evening prayer. I'm going to go do Vespers from my other book. And he went and did evening prayer from the divine office in the old rite. And I was like, wow. I mean, like, he knew that it was enough to do that, but he didn't feel right about it. And he just was like, oh, it's so anemic. I can't believe this. And then he went and prayed us. And I was like, well, I mean, at least he sat with us for, he didn't hurl or something. I don't know. But I just thought, wow, holy cow. I mean, and then those are in the traditionalist movement, the priests are not to be questioned. Like, what they say goes. And even if their preferences are a little out of whack or something, it's like, but they say the Latin Mass, they're untouchable. Like, you just can't even assume that they do anything wrong, because, you're treading on holy ground. And it's like, whoa, wait, I don't know. It's just, I don't think that teaching is anywhere in official church history or tradition that, it puts a priest and his opinions so high above questioning or anything. But that is a phenomenon. I've definitely met it. Yeah. But okay. My next question would be, the more radical trad groups assert that if you switch to the Novus Ordo, which they hold to be harmful to the faith, it will deteriorate your morals over time. So if people do leave and start acting or dressing any differently, or give up veiling or receiving communion kneeling or something like that, a rad trad would say that's the logical consequence of their decision to defect. But is that truly the case? Or is their new behavior an effort to distance themselves from the excesses or the wounds inflicted by their experience in traditionalism? What would you say about that?
Sure. I mean, it just depends on, the importance that you're giving to something, and emphasis, right? So if your emphasis of like wearing a chapel veil is one of, you're supposed to be submissive as a woman, you have a lower place in the hierarchy of the church, or this is, you need to cover your hair because it's a distraction at Mass, right? If you were given those kinds of negative reasons, then you might want to stop doing it at first. It doesn't mean you might not rediscover it later and rediscover a lot of the beauty and the beautiful reasons behind it. But you may, because you're doing something maybe for the wrong reasons, sometimes it's good to distance yourself a little bit from that, or sometimes that's just what happens is you distance yourself from it until you're able to rediscover it. And I mean, there are a lot of things that the traditionalists consider as essentials, which are really non-essentials. I mean, and honestly, one of those, of course, there's this trend among traditionalists, and it's kind of a mixed bag, because I remember seeing a lot of girls wearing pants. They would never do it around any of the priests, or going to the church or anything, but at home sometimes I would see them wearing pants. But there's this attitude that women shouldn't wear pants, that wearing pants is wrong. And then there are those who are definitely more strict about it. And Bishop Williamson was one of those that was known for saying women should never wear pants, right? And it was actually an Ephesus priest that pointed out to me a document from a pope, because there was a culture, I think it was around the time of the 6th century, one of the cultures were coming into the church, and the women wore pants. It was a normal part of their culture for the women to dress like that. And they asked Rome, they asked the Pope, should we be changing our women's dress? Is wearing pants wrong? And the Pope said, well, if you want to, we think there are many beautiful reasons for being able to, for there's a beauty, the dress and the skirt is a beautiful expression, and you're more than welcome to do that. But what is more important than wearing a dress or wearing pants is whether or not you're putting on Christ. And he said that's the spirit behind what you're wearing, right? And so, because you could wear a dress or a skirt in a way that's completely immodest, right? Just as you could wear a pair of beautiful, elegant pants that are also modest and in a way that is perfectly feminine. And I've seen it multiple times. And so he did not actually say wearing pants was wrong, and he said they could continue, but he said the spirit of the thing is that we put on Christ. And so that's just one example where people might say, this is of the devil. And don't you know that the Freemasons were trying to subvert the fashion industry, and they were using pants to do that, so men's eyes would be drawn to their backsides and everything, and they get so caught up in that. It's like, yeah, that may have been, that may very well have been a motivation for them for certain fashion industries, right? Them to design certain kinds of pants, but just because somebody is trying to abuse something does not make that thing. Because there's a big difference between skinny jeans or yoga pants and a beautiful flowing pair of pants, some of which even look like a skirt.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, there's a broad spectrum. So that would be the first thing I would say, is that, I mean, many times what they're pointing at other people and saying, look, now see they're defecting, they're becoming lax, is actually because their view is tainted by the very limiting and constricted traditionalist worldview, which say you dress in this way, you act in this way, you do these things, right? Rather than something that's a little bit more broad and universal and accepting, and realizes that sometimes there is a variance.
Right. Yeah, that's really good point. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I just wondered about that. It's like, well, for some people it could be that they just kind of let things go, and they're like, I'm just gonna, be loose now, and I don't have to worry about all that. I don't have, other dreads breathing down my neck telling me I need to do this and that, so the pressure's off, I can do whatever. And maybe they were kind of waiting for a reason to get away with stuff, if you will. But others, I mean, if they really were like that, then why would they even stay in the church? So it kind of makes me wonder. I mean, if
sure. Well, yeah. And let's say they even do go too far. Let's say they do. Why is that also not the fault of an overly restrictive or oppressive way of doing things? Something that actually gave a distaste for those good things. Like that's just because there may be some loosey-goosey and laxity in the broader Catholic culture doesn't mean that that is necessarily that necessarily extends to. Oh, did I lose you, Laura?
Oh my gosh, Andrew, I'm so sorry.
Oh, what happened?
My battery died in my computer. Like it's plugged in, but the cord stopped charging, and so then all of a sudden it just shut down. I was so interested in
Hallelujah.
what you were saying.
It
I
wasn't
was
me.
like,
It
I'm
wasn't
watching
me
my
for a
battery.
change. It wasn't me for a change.
Oh my gosh, yeah, right. You're not alone. Oh man. The last words I heard you say were loosey goosey. And I was like, oh, let's get back to that.
Yeah. So yeah, like I was saying, it might you might have that experience, but again, just because there is a presence of lax people or people who aren't necessarily going the extra mile and really trying to live things out, we have to remember that the church, as Christ said, is a broad net that brings in all of the sinners, everyone at all the different stages, from super lax and hardly living their faith to the most fervent saint. And so you can't just look and say if most of a parish seems to be a bit more on the lukewarm side. I mean, it would be so wrong to just be like, oh yes, that's because of what they're doing in the mass. That's the post hoc ergo propter fallacy. That because of this, therefore that, right? There may be laxity in that parish because the priest is more lax and isn't living according to the Christian faith as fervently as he could be. Or there are all kinds of cultural influences there. People are allowing themselves to be influenced by. There are so many different factors that go into play. And I mean, the fact that there were liberal or progressive or lax or sinful parishes in church history, even those that said the 1962 or the 1958 missal show, you couldn't say, well, it's because of that missal that they were lax. There has always been laxity. There has always been that. So it's just so silly to say that laxity or them being like that is because of the mass. It's just, yeah, it's a very dumb reason.
Right. Would you say there's a certain recovery period needed for people to regain their spiritual equilibrium after leaving traditionalism? Like, how is that for you and your family?
Yes. Oh yes, definitely. Because you've been part of like a separate family, a separate community, and you've been living in this kind of time bubble, which really isn't a time bubble, because of course there's been further interpretations and developments that'll happen whether you like it or not, but it's happened under the direction of whoever the leadership happens to be of that group. And you're coming back into the living, breathing, dynamic family of God that is the church. And things change, and so much of your mentality may shift about certain things that, again, like I said, you thought were essentials, but actually you had blown out of proportion, or you had made it an end when it was supposed to be a means. And so you have to reorder the hierarchy of truths in your mind. You have to reorder your intellect to thinking in a different way, especially since it's not self-directed Catholicism anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have a responsibility? I mean, again, the accusation that you're just turning your brain off is a stupid one, because that's the same one that the Protestants say. They say, oh, you Catholics, you just go and you turn your brain off, and traditionalists are making the same claim about those of us who want to be faithful. Oh, you're just turning your brain off and going in. No, of course, we still recognize an unfaithful bishop or an unfaithful priest, or that we have to, or maybe a bad liturgy or a bad situation. And you still have to adapt and improvise and take care of things in that way. But we aren't directing our own religion anymore. We aren't directing our own faith and rejecting this, rejecting our bishop, or rejecting our pope, or rejecting a council, or rejecting a missal, right? Yeah. There's a big difference in that. But what we're doing is we're actually coming and we're starting to have a Catholic frame of mind. And that's one that is of fidelity, of faithful submission to the church, to those in authority who God has given the keys of the kingdom, in the persons of our Holy Father in Rome for the Universal Church, and then as well as the bishop of our diocese, who represents Christ for us. So that's a different way of thinking. And then of course there's a healing that often comes in your memory, memory and memories you might have, emotions, a reordering of your will. So yeah, there is definitely a conversion process. Like I said, my experience, it took me years before getting to that point of embracing in gratitude the gift of the church, the gift of the Reformed rites, rather than distrusting the church. I still had not fully trusted the church. And I'd say that's probably the one thing that people are going to have to heal over is trust, because you have been programmed according to the traditionalist narrative that everything's controlled by Freemasons, controlled by Jews, controlled by communists. There's infiltration everywhere. You can't trust anyone, right? Everywhere is an abuse. Abuse is everywhere, right? Idolatry in the Vatican, worshiping a Pachamama, right?
Yeah.
These ridiculous spins on events that take place that were either completely harmless or just completely misunderstood, or maybe even got a little bit out of hand. I mean, an example, for example, was Assisi. People are so scandalized. They put a Buddha on the altar, and that just goes to show, right? And Cardinal Arenze, who I think, is it Francis Arenze? Cardinal, though his last name is Arenze. He was a famous cardinal, but he used to be prefect for the Congregation of the Sacraments, of the Liturgy and the Sacraments, a Congregation of Divine Worship. And he was very well known because he stood up for Catholics' rights to receive kneeling and on the tongue, right?
Yeah.
And he was known as being a very faithful, very orthodox bishop. He was actually the bishop that was put in charge and helped coordinate the prayer for peace at Assisi. He worked with John Paul II to do that. And in his autobiography, interview that is out there that you can read, I'm trying to remember what it's called. Might be An Invisible Hand. I think might be the title of that one. He gives an account of the events that happened at Assisi. And one of them was that, unfortunately, when you have all these people coming together, sometimes things get out of hand, right? I mean, things aren't organized properly, or somebody's letting down the job. And that was a complete accident. It wasn't something the Buddhists were trying to do to insult the Catholics or disrespect the Catholics. They just thought it was, a platform, right? Like a table they could put their Buddha up on.
Yeah.
So it was just a complete mistake. And we have to understand that there's going to be that kind of human error and have mercy. But no, the traditionalist narrative is that the popes were disrespecting God. Archbishop Lefebvre, there was idolatry in the Vatican, just like they're saying about Pope Francis with the whole Pachamama thing. Right. And it's completely unfair, and it's a rigid and narrow perspective on things. And it takes time to break out of that and to learn to trust the church again.
Right. No, that's really, really good comments. Yeah. And people make mistakes sometimes. And, it's like, wow. So just because you're a pope or a bishop, you can't make a mistake. Or if you make one mistake, it totally invalidates all the good you ever did. Like, a parent yells at their kid one day, and from that day on, they're a terrible parent, and nobody should have any, put any stock in them. It's like, wow, those are some pretty rigid standards. Whoa. I wanted to ask, what would you say to someone who has been hurt or scandalized by traditionalism and is hesitant to give Catholicism another try?
That's an interesting question, because when you go to, I remember coming across, somebody sent me a link to a support group. I think it was in Reddit. It was a subreddit about people who were former traditionalist Catholics.
Oh, I read that same one. Oh my God.
Yes. And so people like Steve Skojec, right, who have lost faith in the church, are even wondering about the existence of God, right? So they're either they're agnostic or they're atheist, but they generally become anti-Catholic because of certain negative experiences, whether it was a very abusive situation maybe they encountered, or it was just the rigidity and the inability of traditionalist Catholicism to authentically adapt to the modern world in healthy ways. It would be helpful to recognize that the problem was not with Catholicism; it was with a dysfunctional practice of Catholicism. But it's very hard. It's very hard to be able to see that, though, because many of these people say, well, no, it's just cult. It's just like a cult. And there are actually books out there by non-believing, professionals, like psychiatrists, psychologists, who analyze human behavior and say religion is just a cult. And so traditionalist Catholicism is just a newer version of the cult, and Christianity is an older and more experienced and more, sly kind of a cult. And so they say, I don't want to have anything to do with a cult. I've had this bad experience with this cult, so I don't want to go into the Catholic cult as well. And of course, I would just invite them to not just take what those professors or those experts have to say at face value. There's so much more to it than that. Being part of a society, a part of a community, part of a family, and united over a common pursuit as a human being is deeply human. Can it become negative because of our inclination toward evil or our easily corruptible nature by things like power or money and things like that? Yes, but that does not mean we should give up on society, on politics, on the institution of the family, and definitely not on the community of the church, which is a pursuit, and of religion, which is a pursuit of God, a pursuit of the supernatural, which has been a universal part of civilization since the beginning of time. And that to just label that as a cult and say that there's no longer any value to that would be completely ignorant and will be completely unhistorical, right? But it's easy to do when you're in an emotionally raw state. But I would just invite anybody who may be struggling with that to maybe realize that maybe they were in a more of a destructive community, and that the authentic living of Catholicism is actually something that's very beautiful and very healthy, and something that nurtures and strengthens you rather than tears you down and wounds you. Yeah,
right. No, I think that's so interesting. I mean, there's obviously a great outflux of people that leave the church. And a lot of those people, from what I understand and what I've encountered, it's usually ignorance about what the church is and how important it is that leads those people to just kind of give up the faith. But even within traditionalist circles, I mean, the statistics are the same or even higher sometimes as far as who is leaving the church and how frequently that happens. It just seems crazy, And I don't hear that talked about a lot, but I've definitely heard it repeatedly. Even there have been like research statistics out there you can find. I can put some in the description below that I've found. But yeah, it's like 70, 80% people leaving the church at, eventually, or when they reach adulthood. It's like, that's insane. I mean, terrible. But if you're leaving traditionalism, like, you're not a traditionalist because you just wandered in and like you just thought, oh, I'll just keep coming back here every Sunday. Like you said, you go and you find the answers, you find reasons, you want to believe in what you're doing. And so for them, I feel like it's more of an issue of being abused or scandalized or just burned out. It's like the bad news church instead of the good news church. Because if there were no crisis, you wouldn't have to be hanging on to what you're doing, or you wouldn't be justified in your disobedience, right? So it's like they've got to keep it always like stirred up and all panicky. So everybody's like,
yes, that's right. Yes, that's exactly right. And that's something I've actually pointed out on a few different occasions is if this traditionalist Catholicism is the answer, why does it seem to be failing just as dismally? When it comes to vocations, if you look at the vocations and that are in like the society priests or different religious communities associated with them, and you look at that number compared to the number of people who adhere or support the SSPX or Traditionalist Catholicism worldwide, it's dismal. I mean, it's dismal numbers.
You would expect it to be a lot more.
Exactly. If it's just supposed to flourish because of this type of living of Catholicism, why aren't we seeing that? And I know that because of traditional Catholicism, my other the siblings who were older and understanding what was going on, they would have left the church. They were on the verge of losing their faith. They would have gone Protestant. They would have gone agnostic, unbelieving, and part of that was the realization that the whole thing was a facade, that it was hypocrisy, that
Yeah.
why should we give assent and to the authority in the society or the authority in whatever state of a contest group or whatever leader you happen to be following? Why should we assent to him when he's not assenting to the Pope, when he's not assenting to his bishop, right? It undermines the authority, and it is a living hypocrisy, and they see through it. They see through that. Because one of the things, of course, was my parents were taking traditionalism to its logical conclusion, which was where they were ending up home alone, because none of the traditionalist clergy have mission, and so none of them have the authority to be able to offer the sacraments or teach, so you can't go there. And you reject the Novus Ordo Church because it's fallen into heresy and is apostatized, so you just have to stay at home and be a recusant Catholic. And my sister was dating a Protestant fella who his family did the same thing. They worshiped at home. And she was going, how is this any different from what we're doing? How are we any different than the Protestants, right? And maybe somebody with the SSPX might hear this and say, well, that's off the deep end. That's not us. The SSPX, people in the SSPX always love to use Sedevacantist as a scapegoat, right? We're not like them. We're not Sedevacantist. You call them out for being unfaithful to the Pope and rejecting the Pope's authority. Oh, but we're not Sedevacantist, right? They're always using that as a scapegoat. And it's ignoring the crux of the matter, which is that they're doing the same thing that the Sedevacantists are doing. They're just doing it in a different way, right? They're rebelling against authority and they're worshiping on their own. But instead of a family, right? Instead of a family worshiping on their own, rejecting the clergy, it's clergy worshiping on their own, rejecting the bishop or rejecting the Pope, right? So it's just a different level, right?
Right. Oh my gosh, that's nuts. Well, I mean, and like you've said before, that Sedevacantism is the logical conclusion of like the society's mentality, because the society's like, there's error within the church, there's these problems, there's this council that went wrong and all this stuff, but they don't really have an explanation for how that was possible. So the Sedevacantists are like, it isn't possible because the Holy Spirit protects the church, except our reason is that there was no real Pope, that he couldn't, ratify all this stuff and promulgate it because he wasn't even there,
Yeah.
And so then it's like, well, okay, I mean, honestly, that does make more sense. And then, but then, like you say, then you have all these other issues run into admission and stuff. And it's like, yeah, we're just gonna go home and just hunker. I mean, Jerry Matitix, your mom was big into him, and you mentioned him sometimes. Didn't he end up doing that too? It's like,
yes.
Well, yeah, one of the more prominent ones. Oh, here's a question. Okay, before we wrap up, because I don't want to keep you forever, but what do you feel that traditionalists do well, and what could we learn from them that might improve the Catholic culture of the faithful?
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking this question, because I, of course, always want to acknowledge the good that those who identify themselves as traditional Catholics want, right? What they want are good things. These are good things. And we all, of course, want to encourage that. And I think it was it G.K. Chesterton? I believe it was G.K. Chesterton who said that an error, an ideology, right, or a heresy is not so much a vice or something that's evil, but rather it's a virtue gone mad.
Oh yeah.
Right. And I think that that's so good, is that these things such as, reverent worship, like that is a virtue, right? But if you are putting that in a proper context or out of its proper context, right? Or if you are abusing that good, or you're elevating that good that's supposed to be a means into an end, that's when it's a virtue that goes mad, right? It becomes an idol. It becomes something that's destructive. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying is that you can still have these good things, but you have to have them in the right context. Otherwise, it turns to dust in your mouth. Otherwise, it actually ends up being a destructive influence in your life that ends up undermining your faith, undermining things rather than actually growing it. And so if we can, as I've talked about with Dom on the Logos Project, when we've talked about the traditional Catholic movement, if we can realize our mistakes that we have made, in the traditional Catholic movement, and the spirit of rebellion, whether you call that, loyal disobedience, loyal dissent, resistance, noble resistance, whatever you want to call it, right? And if we repent of that and reorient the movement back into the heart of the church, and we're willing to give up things and sacrifice our own wills and work within the context of the church, to bring those good things, even if it doesn't look like what we want it to look like, right? You can still work toward reverence and worship without having it look like, exactly these specifics in the 1962 missal, or, the 1958, Easter week, or whatever, particular liturgical expression you may be fixated on. You can work toward what it is you authentically want, and it can be achieved within that and within the church. And it's within the church that Christ is going to give it fruit, and that it's going to blossom in your heart. And it's actually going to be beneficial not only to you, but to the church, and build up the church as a whole. So we need to get away from this spirit of rebellion and negativity and attacking of the church, and actually begin to support the church, give up some of the things that we want in order, and have humility, admit our faults. And by doing that, the beautiful things that the traditional Catholic community has to offer will then be able to bear fruit in the family of God, the church.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, it's so good. I mean, the traditionalists, I do have to give them credit for, they don't want to, like, pardon my French, they don't want to half-ass Catholicism. They want to do it 100%. And they take more trouble than most to educate themselves about stuff, or the lives of the saints, or things like that. It's like, wow, I mean, you're so dedicated because you want to know. So you go to school on things, and if you hold contrary opinions to the main line, you've got to be able to support that. So they do really put some work into that. It's like, wow, if every Catholic did as much towards just general, learning about the church and their heritage and why it's important to do what we do, we'd be bringing so many more people into the church, and we'd never want to leave.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Also, leaving traditionalism behind doesn't mean leaving all the good stuff. In your own life, you've, kind of learn that as you go, and in your family with your wife and your kids, or your extended family with your parents and siblings, like, you guys are still keeping things going that are very Catholic and very fruitful, and like Catholic culture that you're doing in your homes. But how, I don't know if you want to enumerate on any of those, like, things that you can keep in your life and that you can promote with other people and grow in community, that could encourage other people who are even thinking about leaving traditionalist groups. Like, it's not all bleak. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Like, what can we say to those people?
Yes, definitely. Everything that is good is meant to be experienced. Everything that is good of God is meant to be experienced within God's covenant family, not outside of it. Because you can only experience the fullness. It's like the difference between being served a hot home cooked meal, and your mother brings out the steaming goodness and puts it onto the table, right? And then you can partake of that with your brothers and sisters and father and mother, and maybe even aunts and uncles and grandparents if there's an extended family gathering, rather than, say, experiencing that same food outside of that context, maybe going, having leftovers that are a few days old, outside of that context, or going through a McDonald's drive-through, right? These lesser, I mean, we all do it, right? I mean, but the different experiences and how the benefits that you are going to have from those two experiences, or the cons, right? I mean, you're going to be more healthy, both in your body as well as in your emotions, and your unity with your family in the first context, right? Than you are, going by yourself, going through the drive-through, or eating by yourself, or anything like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so these things are meant, like the scriptures and all of these traditions, all of these things flowed from the heart of the church, right? The church was there first. And that's why in 1 Timothy 3:15, he says that the church is the pillar and foundation of truth, right? Because it's from the church that all of these good things come to us. And so they're supposed to be experienced within that context. And so all these things that you love can be experienced even more fully within the church, and you will get so much more from them, and you'll be so much happier and so much more full of joy, because it'll be happening in the family context rather than in a more limiting and even sometimes selfish environment.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, and thank you for sharing all your stories and your experience. And I don't have any questions in the viewer chat. We'll make one last call for questions if anybody wants to ask you any.
Sure.
But yeah, one thing that what you're saying about experiencing things more fully in the broader church, because we're all in the one family again, it's making me think about families that I've talked to who raised their kids exclusively in the 1962 mass. They then, when they switch over, they join the church, and they are experiencing the Novus Ordo, sometimes in English, sometimes Latin and English, and the response of their children is really interesting. Like their young children, they'll say, I feel closer to Jesus now than I ever did. Or, just like they're so much more attentive during mass, or things like that the parents never expected. Because, right, so many parents in tradition, they're so concerned that they've got to do what they're doing, even if they don't really feel right about it, because it's like, I have no other option. I've got to raise my kids to be a faithful Catholic. So what can I do? And when they're willing to trust the church and open themselves up to that fuller communion and experience, it actually ends up blessing them like quickly.
Yes, definitely. As a matter of fact, what is I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name who does the Holy Smokes channel, Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism and Conversation, or something like that. Because he did an interview recently with Dom. And in that interview, he gives a bit of his testimony of kind of being in that trad mentality, or being in that mentality of like constantly on the offensive, constantly attacking, constant negativity whenever they would go to mass, and what that did to him spiritually, and then kind of his conversion from that, and an embracing of some of those negative elements. And it was just so inspiring listening to his testimony, where he was actually able to come to terms, or come and make peace with maybe a bad hymn, right? Or somebody being disrespectful, or somebody maybe not dressed the greatest. And that he was actually able to turn that into a sacrifice, right? Turn that discomfort that he was feeling. And like that, to me, like if you're able to do that, it actually harkens back to something I remember hearing from J.R.R. Tolkien. He said, when he was talking about the mass, he said, don't go to a mass where you're perfectly comfortable. He said, go where there is a woman clacking her beads on the, on the pews, or, or the priest isn't being as attentive and everything. And because then you can remember, you'll have something to offer up. You'll have something to offer at the sacrifice, and realize it's not about you, that you have to die to yourself, and realize that you're just as imperfect as all of those other people. Right. And that's such a beautiful Christian spirit.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, that's just community life. That's family.
Yes.
It's like, oh my gosh, so many mornings doing morning prayer with my family, and my brother is sitting across the way blowing his nose over and over and over. And I'm just like, how am I supposed to be praying? Why are you blowing your nose? It's like, I can't even stop and say something, but it's like, this is okay. Yeah. It's all going to work out. It's like, maybe it was better prayer when I was listening to that than the other hours of the day, when it was like, oh, he's just sitting there quietly, oh yeah, no.
Right. Yes. Yep. And that, I mean, God gives us consolations, right? He does give us those times of prayer, like those times of worshiping in the mass where, like there aren't quite as many distractions, maybe even none. And everything seems to be just reverent, and you get in that zone, right? And God gives us those consolations. But it seems like more often than not, he gives us then those dry spells, right? He gives us those times that are more difficult, because he wants to challenge us and see, are you in this for you, or are you in it for me, right? That's a classic principle of the spiritual life, is when God takes away those consolations and the things that make us happy or feel good about worship. will we still remain with him? Will we still be faithful? Will we still stand at the foot of the cross with Mary and with John? And that's the decision that's before every traditional Catholic is this about me, right? Is this about me and what I want? Or is it about what God wants? And the way we know what God wants, of course, is through the church, right? He who hears you hears me, right?
Mhm.
And so we have to have that kind of a spirit when it comes to these
Right.
things.
Like Cardinal Journet saying that we're entering into a mystery, like a hidden future, a future which is hidden from us. It's
Yes.
like, yeah, I'm suffering so much. He feels like he's cleaving his own flesh and blood by giving this up. But at the same time, he's not whining. He's not asking people to feel sorry for him. He's not saying, why, God? He's just like, I don't even need to know why. This makes the sacrifice even better because I'm doing it blindly through faith
Mhm.
and just because I love God, and this will help me to love him more. And it is painful. I mean, I remember your mom said something about like after going to her first Novus Ordo, she was so shell shocked. Like after leaving traditionalism, she cried like all
Yes.
the way home. She was just miserable, but
Right.
she knew she had to do it, and she had to put herself through that because that was her what it took to get her over her prejudices and her re-entering into the church. But it did not feel good. I mean, eventually
Yes.
that wasn't the case anymore, but it was rough at first, and so that's
That's right.
a
It
real thing.
is. Absolutely. It is certainly a rough transition because being faithful is hard. Being faithful is putting yourself right on that cross with Jesus, allowing yourself to be nailed. If you're perfectly comfortable and happy, you might not be in a good spot.
Mhm.
So that, I mean, we're called to be challenged, right? We're called to take up our crosses and follow Christ. And even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient, and even if we don't maybe think that it's the right direction, maybe it's unjust, right? You have all those examples in throughout history of the unjust persecution of the saints, but they bore it with patience and with a spirit of humility,
Yeah.
and that, having that example really helps us. I love to encourage people to immerse themselves in the lives of the saints, because when you do that, it gives you an example of how to live as an authentic Catholic, rather than some of these other, some other examples of maybe political people, right, who usually don't make the decisions according to the principles of virtue or the spiritual life, but rather expedience or what they think is right or according to their cause, right?
Yeah.
But we're
Right.
supposed to see not as with the eyes of the world, but with the eyes of Christ. And
Right.
and the saints help us to do that because they did that in the context that they lived in.
Right. Right. That's awesome. It makes me think of even how so many traditionalists, they just love Padre Pio so much. And I love him too. I think he's awesome.
Mhm.
But it's so interesting how certain aspects of his life aren't really talked about then. It's like he was unjustly suspended from his priestly ministry, but he didn't, open an appeal, and he didn't kick up a big storm or anything. He just waited it out because he knew that if he was faithful, God would give it back to him. And sure enough,
Yes.
that's what happened. And it was like, wow. I mean, that was hard. I mean, I've heard other priests talk about being suspended at times, or a suspect of some kind of crime or something, and how miserable they were. They're just like, wow, I feel so like useless and misunderstood. Like I don't even know who I am anymore practically, but it passed because they endured.
That's
It's
right. Yeah. Yeah. God always eventually comes to the rescue of his faithful one, of his beloved. And yes, Padre Pio was such a great example to me of an authentic Catholic attitude toward the papacy, not one of just toleration. Well, of course, and definitely not one of disdain, but not one of toleration or one of just political
yeah.
expedience, but one of devotion. There were three items that the in his cell, in Padre Pio's cell, that he had, and it was a crucifix, a statue of Our Lady, and a picture of the Pope.
Oh.
And at the time, and that included Pope Paul VI. And that always struck me because, of course, Pope Paul VI, right? He oversaw the Second Vatican Council, the destruction of the Roman Reich. He did all
Yeah.
these terrible things, right? According to the traditionalist narrative. How could Padre Pio have devotion to a man who is destroying the faith, right?
Right.
And that already should be like a red flag. It's like, okay, don't you think that if Paul VI was evil and destroying the church, that maybe this prophetic figure, Padre Pio, would be used by God to highlight that, right?
Yeah.
But no, it's the exact opposite. You have nothing but devotion. And when you look, and he even wrote his sister who was having a struggles with her convent, and he said, because they were going a little bit off the deep end, and he said, I know that you are right and they are wrong, but still you must obey, right? He had this right, he had this right spirit of obedience. And I know, even though he requested to be able to say the mass of his childhood, the mass of his ordination, right? To still say the 1962 rite of mass. If he had been, if Paul VI, if Pope Paul VI had requested him to say the Reformed rite of mass, he would have done it in a heartbeat, because that was the level of his devotion to the papacy. Because when you look at the how traditionalist Catholics, if it's not one of hatred and animosity toward the Pope, which it usually is, if it's not that, it's one of indifference, that he is a political figure of the church somewhere out there, and we tolerate him, and maybe sometimes he has these roles in these very limited situations that almost happen never, but otherwise he doesn't really have much relevance to my life. And
Right.
Devotion to the papacy is actually a fundamental part of a Catholic's life, of a Catholic spiritual life. Not just respect, not just assent, devotion to the papacy, right? And
Right.
it should send off warning bells when these people start calling those of us who are faithful to the popes papolaters or hyper papalists, that we're adoring the popes, right? That's such a ludicrous. Well, maybe there are some people out there who have an exaggerated notion of the papacy. Sure.
Yeah.
I think they're few and far between. I think most people are probably not going to tell you that if the Pope said Italian sausages are better than Polish sausages, that he's infallible, or that something in an interview is infallible, or anything like that, right? I mean, that's going to be pretty rare. Most people do not see the Pope as a god, right? So that's setting up a straw man. That's setting up a caricature. But we're called to more than just seeing him as a figurehead. We're called to devotion to him as our Father. Because in the Pope, we see Christ, we see the authority of Christ. It's in the Pope that Christ makes his authority present to us. And that's all the religious orders, all the faithful religious orders that have stood the test of time, are because they have been devoted to the papacy. The papacy, and through that, the papacy has shown its favor, its love, and its approbation, and they have blossomed and flourished within the church, right?
Right.
So it's so good to remember that, and to remember that the papacy isn't just again, he's not just a political figure. We can't reduce that role just to that. That's very unhealthy.
Right. Well, I mean, you even told me you're in the chapel you attended growing up. They had a picture of the Pope. Did they also have one of the bishop, or just the Pope?
In our chapel, I think they had. I know they had the Pope. They may have had
But he
the
was
bishop.
in the sacristy.
I have seen. Yeah, I'd seen bishops. Yeah, like often they will have the bishop as well. If they don't have the bishop, they at least have the Pope. But yeah, they usually have the picture hanging up.
Right. But he's in the sacristy, like where only the servers and the priests are even going to see him. But in the entrance of the church, where like diocesan parishes all have the Pope and the bishop's pictures, they have a picture of Archbishop Lefebvre. Yes. It's like, it makes me think about wacko parishes where they put the Eucharistic, the tabernacle in a little separate room off to the side where you like walk and you're like, where's Jesus? But it's like that. You're doing that with the Pope. You're sticking him in a corner where nobody's even going to see him, let alone, even just to think of him and pray for him.
No, it's actually, it's a sign. It's a signification. It's a sign of an invisible reality, right? Which is
Yeah.
exactly what they've done to the Pope in real life, right? Put him in
Yeah.
the corner, put him in the sacristy,
Yeah.
look over and,
That's how important Father is in
here's
this
that
family.
heretic.
He's
Yeah, he's
bad
our
word. We
wayward
don't talk
father.
about him.
Yeah,
Like
we
he's
don't have
a
anything to
shame and a
do with.
disgrace.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it definitely is as a symbol of the attitude toward the papacy, and
Yeah.
it's really bizarre. One of the last debate discussion that I had with a SSPX priest, um, he had this odd when I started pointing to him that his order, the SSPX's position toward the papacy and toward the church were actually untraditional and were not authentic examples of Christian obedience. He proceeded to yell at me and tell me that I needed to know my place and that there was no one who were more faithful to the Pope than the SSPX and the priests of the SSPX, that they were the most faithful of anyone in the church to them. I mean, he couldn't back that up. All he could do was scream it at me.
Wow.
But it just goes to show that they have this narrative that says we're actually being faithful. We're being more faithful to the Pope than anyone else is because we're preserving tradition. And that's
Yeah.
what the Pope would really want us to do. So we're actually being more faithful to the Pope. So we're actually more loyal to him, right? So they have this whole thing that they do to convince themselves that what they're doing is right.
Right.
And when you start calling that into question, they often proceed to get very nervous or emotional.
Well, because they know better. Just like every other heretic in church history or schismatic, they knew better than the rest of the church. They knew better than the Father. It's like saying, I'm a child who hasn't talked to my parents for decades, but I'm a better child than the rest of you because I'm really doing what I should be doing as a good child. My parents just don't understand it. Nobody gives me any credit for it. And it's like, and I'm persecuted because I'm in the right. So that's a sign that I'm in the right because I'm being persecuted for it. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's a really interesting corner to back yourself into.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing how we can convince ourselves, right? We
Yeah.
can convince ourselves of what we're doing and what it's right. And we can come up with very sophisticated reasons, right, for
Yeah.
doing it. But the definition of heresy, right, when you look at the etymology of the word, it's to choose one's own will, to choose one's own way. The heretic is the one who rejects the authority of the church, rejects the doctrines that they don't like and accepts the doctrines that they do and comes up with reasons to justify what they've done, right? That's what heresy is. It's a choosing of your own will above the will of the church.
Oh, wow.
Schism the same way, right? But
Yeah.
heresy is in the realm of belief and the faith, and schism is in the realm of action and, the life of the church.
Wow. So interesting. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for all your time and everything that you give to talking about this and helping people. We really appreciate it. So
Yes, you're very welcome, Laura. It's my pleasure.
oh, awesome. Well, maybe we'll do it again sometime, or we'll see you on other shows. So everyone, Andrew has done several shows with the Logos Project. Actually, tomorrow afternoon. What time, Andrew? 2?
I'm not sure. I would have to look it up to see, what it is Eastern time. Because of
But
course it would
tomorrow.
only,
Oh, okay. But
or
you guys are
Central.
doing the last video in your series about the
Yes,
SSPX with John Salza.
that's
And
right.
that's
Yeah.
why it
Yeah. If you
really
go to the Logos Project and go to live streams,
okay.
it will come up what the time is for your
All
region.
right.
But yeah, tomorrow, sometime depending on where you're at, early afternoon to late afternoon, we'll be doing the last in our series on the SSPX specifically, our Contra Tratum series. This last one is going to be on the errors of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. So there's going to be some very, very revealing quotes that we're going to provide from him, and pointing out some of the positions he held and how they were not actually compatible or consistent with the defined doctrines of the church or the traditional teaching of the church. So he's not the faithful Orthodox leader that many portray him to be. As a matter of fact, he came up with many errors and heresies to justify his actions. So yes, please, we definitely invite you to come and join us for that.
Yeah, that whole series has been awesome. I've been listening to each video multiple times because they're so packed. So I really, really recommend them. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming on. Thank you, Andrew. And you have a wonderful afternoon. God bless you so much.